Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Stan Goldstein. I am with Kates Boylston Publications. Welcome to the webinar, How to Improve Your Bottom Line, presented by the Johnson Consulting Group. Today we are pleased to have Nelson Thulin, Director of Business Consulting for the Johnson Consulting Group. He will be discussing how the profitability equation answers what it costs to run a funeral home, what happens when revenue increases or decreases, and gives strategies to reduce expenses. If you have any questions, you can type them in as Nelson gives his talk, but please, we'll hold the questions to the end, and then we'll get to as many as we can. Nelson, please take it away.
Thank you, Stan. Again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address the group today. Normally, we would be calling, or I would be calling from Scottsdale, Arizona, the headquarters there for Johnson Consulting. But today, I happen to be deep in the heart of Texas, and so I'm coming at you remote here. And we'll get started with what Stan talked about, how to improve your bottom line. The first step, just to, here we go. Just to give you a little background of why Johnson Consulting would be even involved with offering up information. It's our background and experience. We've got a 42-member team, of which 18 of them are consultants with an average of 33 plus years of experience in the profession, all totaled over 600 years of operating large organizations, small organizations, and everything in between: funeral homes, cemeteries, involvement with casket, vault companies. So we've seen just about everything there. We're responsible for over $2 billion in transactions and deals, changing hands from ownership to next generation or buyouts between funeral homes. And finally, I'm speaking to you specifically from the business consulting side. And between business consulting, our accounting providers, and our performance tracker, we serve over 145 annual cases amongst the clients that we serve, and over $600 million in annual revenue. So combined, we have a lot of opportunities to work through all kinds of scenarios, and most importantly of all, to help people make money and hang on to their money. And really, that's what we're talking about today. So to give a little bit of my age away, back in the 70s when I was in high school, one of my favorite comedians was Steve Martin. And he was kind of this wild, crazy guy, for those that don't know who Steve Martin was. And he was just kind of one-liners. Today, I've been told that they're called dad jokes, of which I am accused of telling quite often. But back then, one of his things is he would start off this joke about saying that he was someday going to write a book on how to be a millionaire. And the first chapter would be, first, get $1 million. And I think that's a little bit what we're talking about here. We're all looking to make money in businesses, and the important piece of it is not just to be a millionaire, but to stay a millionaire. If you are, or at any level of wealth, the idea is to make the money, and you do what you want with that money, whether it's for charitable purposes or to grow a enterprise that is handed down to next generations, or to give you a healthy opportunity to retire and enjoy the fruits of your labors. But the truth of the matter is, you can make money, but as soon as you spend the money, like we were talking about with regards to a millionaire, the fact is, as soon as you spend any of your money, you're no longer a millionaire, right? And that's one thing that Steve didn't realize, that just writing a book and saying how to be a millionaire doesn't really make it happen. The end result is, how do you keep your money, retain the revenue that you make by minimizing the expenses and keeping the largest margin of profit that you want. And that's what we talk about when we talk about the profitability equation. It's really very simple. It's money coming into the business, the expenses that you incur for running that business, from labor to buying caskets, vaults, and maintaining the facilities, vehicles, everything that goes into providing those services, And once you subtract all that out, that is your profitability. Many times people will focus on a question of revenue. And the question is really not how much you're going to make, but the real question to ask yourself is how much does it take? You can be profitable only if you're spending less money than you're making on the revenue. Consider it this way. If you were going to drive 1,000 miles on a $5 tank of gas, you're probably not going to make it. Same thing with a business in which you have revenues coming in, but the expenses are greater than what you can generate. In both cases, whether you're driving that distance or running that business, you're not going to make it if you're overextending yourself beyond what your revenues can generate. Obviously, you wouldn't start a business if you knew that you were going to lose money in the long run. It just wouldn't make any sense. But oftentimes, we don't start businesses. We inherit businesses. We buy businesses. We transfer other businesses into an existing business. And all those things change the dynamic of that business. Revenues may go down, expenses may go up, or it may do both. And when that happens, you have to be prepared to look at the changes and how it's affecting you. Yeah, even if you choose to incorporate a new service. I think something that's been very popular in the recent past is for people to start thinking about catering. Catering is a wonderful, wonderful additional service, but unless you're pricing it out correctly, you may find out that you're losing money in what you're trying to provide if you don't charge enough for it. Some people will take a loss on things like that in order to be competitive, but you don't want to be taking a loss that you're not aware of. So again, you do things for practical strategy as long as you know why you're doing it. We talk oftentimes with owners and managers of funeral homes, and when we do discuss their expenses, it's never a bad thing when you know what that expense was paid for. The only bad time when you review expenses is when the shoulders go up and the eyebrows go up and everybody's like, I don't really have a clue on what that expense is about. When you don't know, you're flying blind and you're not able to properly make the right decisions for your business unless you know what's going on. So if I were going to write a book on how to improve your bottom line, I would start chapter 1 as get a budget. With a budget, you are able to establish the revenue for year to year and what your expenses are going to be, both fixed and variable. By consistently monitoring your progress throughout the year, you'll be able to understand your cash flow. Cash flow is king in a business. If you don't have money that's flowing out of it after the revenue comes in and the expenses are taken away, you don't have the ability to leverage cash for other investments or to improve your business or to hire somebody if your business grows. You could be growing a business and it's getting more and more difficult for you to operate with your existing staff. But if you're not generating enough expense or generating enough revenue to be offset by the additional expense of labor, your profits would go down. So you do have to understand where you're at, what those margins are that you're going to spend on that. And again, a properly thought out budget, you start with your revenues and you estimate what you will in best case scenario, and also a secondary scenario. You don't want to be overly optimistic, but you make your best estimate about your revenues, and then you also take from that what your expenses are. The key, though, even before you look at revenues, is to look at those expenses. What is it going to cost me if I have to rent the building, if I have to pay salaries, if I have to start buying inventory? All those expenses are critical to knowing how much revenue you need to create just in order to be in business and stay in business. So here is an example of the revenue side of the budget. You will see here that when we estimate that, we look at not only the case volume, but we also look at the case mix. That's critical because as you look through and this is just a quick example, but when looking at it, you can see for yourself that sales averages can change dramatically. You can have at-need sales of over $11,000 and at-need cremation sales of only a little over $5,000. If you were just counting your sales and you didn't see the case mix and the historical trends that take place over time and the effect of those sales averages, you can't accurately predict what your revenue is going to be. We mentioned before about knowing if business is going up and down. If you're looking at the simple numbers of call volume and maybe your overall sales average, but you don't see the trends, if you aren't able to analyze those and see what a 3-year trend is and that you're gradually increasing in cremation, you can actually do more services and lose money. If there's a $6,000 delta between at-need burial and at-need cremation, and your business is sliding in that direction of cremation, even with every single extra funeral you're doing, you're also trying to make up a $6,000 difference between the two. Then we talked about looking at expenses, and this is really the first thing that we talked about in terms of what does it take to make a business work. So again, this is what does it take me to run this business. These are generated major expense categories that we've come up with Johnson Consulting. You'll see in many respects it mirrors a lot of the FTC requirements, but we do this, and we do this with all of our clients. We normalize what their expense categories are, and we're able to come up with industry standards for these various categories. It allows us to make good assessments on whether or not a funeral business or cemetery business is operating efficiently, if their personnel costs are in line with what we see throughout the company, and right on down, all the different expenses. If you're accurately and consistent coding expenses, you will need to have a chart of accounts. When you're working with your admin person or your accountant or CPA, whoever the person is that ultimately puts the dollars into the categories, it's critically important that you're both on the same page. And the only way to assure that is having a chart of accounts. At Johnson Consulting, we provide a chart of accounts that everybody and anybody can use. You can adapt those to whatever your needs are. But even if you don't use something sophisticated as that, you should have a basic understanding of where expenses are going to be tracked and where they're going to be coded to. If you don't, you can't see the variability in what different costs are coming about. For instance, years ago, I was managing a firm, and I just arrived on scene. And as I started going through the expenses and just kind of getting myself familiarized with the company, one particular cost jumped out at me, and I couldn't understand why the water utilities were at $2,000 a month. It just seemed exorbitantly high. This was during the summer months when the sprinkler system was on, and I thought even if that's running full bore, it just seems like a awfully high price that we're spending on utilities for water. So as we did investigate that, we looked back historically, and we could see that, yes, that was correct. Those were extremely high numbers based upon the historical water bill that we had in the past. One thing led to another. We investigated a little bit more. We spoke with the city utilities, and we found out that there was actually a leak in the sprinkler system right near the foundation of the funeral home. At the current time, it had not affected anything in the basement, it hadn't leaked, it hadn't created any damage, but what it was doing was it was pouring water out constantly, 24 hours a day, down the side of our building. And you can imagine at a different time of the year when it would have started freezing and cracking in that particular part of the world, it could have created substantial foundation damage. Not to mention, we were spending $2,000 a month on a water bill that we didn't need to. So something as simple as just coding your expenses and then watching them for spikes and variations, both up and down, it can lead you to uncover things that you possibly never imagined were happening in your funeral home. Once you have your budget, now you get to know well or not the monthly tracking, the comparison to industry standards. So you've got everything laid out in front of you. You know what your revenue is. You have itemized out and put your expenses into their proper categories. And now what happens very often is that all gets set to the side, and maybe when it gets around to tax season, people will pull that out. It's critical to look at these on a monthly basis. If you're looking at something and it's 30, 45 days old, you can now take corrective action and fix something that could be thousands of dollars out of whack by the end of the year, as compared to finding something right now and making the changes and putting a remedy to it and creating the solution for it. What you see here on this combined 12-month rolling trend, this speaks exactly what I was talking about, is that it gives you year-over-year evaluation, also based upon what you're doing for your budget. And then if you notice on here, there's a 12-month rolling average. We keep that into account. So no matter where we are in the year, we got a assessment of what the entire year is. So at this point in time, if we were in July, we'd be looking at this as a 12-month rolling from June from the prior year until July now. And then you can also see that you see month-to-month itemizations of your revenues as well as expenses on the lower level. Again, critical that you're able to watch these things, you're able to interpret what is going on, where revenue is coming from, and potentially where revenue is being lost. Something that I find quite often when we look at the revenue generators and where they're coming from, it's not uncommon in our changing world and what people are looking for in the way of funeral services, that suddenly we are going from 2 days of a decade ago to 1 day to maybe no visitation at all, but it's something just before services. And unless we're watching that, and it's not unusual, funeral directors are good-hearted people. They don't look to overprice anything or have somebody pay for something that they didn't provide an adequate amount of services. So it's not uncommon at all for me to walk into funeral homes and find out that due to the trends changing in terms of service requirements and our delivery, that it may be that we're offering only a 1 day or 1 hour visitation prior to a service on the same day. And that amount that we were previously charging for a visitation, they're no longer charging at all, because again, the funeral director is thinking, it's just an hour before church. It's really nothing extra than I would have otherwise been doing. I can't justify charging someone $500 or $600 for a visitation when in fact it boils down to an hour before church. And in doing so, all of that revenue is lost. And we see that, and we have no complaints with the funeral director's decisions to make a choice and save the family some additional money if in fact they don't feel as though they're providing the full level of service that they would for a full night visitation with 3 or 4 hours. But what you can do is move some of those dollars around. So maybe you had a $500 visitation before, maybe it's $300 now or $200 visitation, and that other money is moved into categories that you are going to collect, i.e. the service itself, or maybe the rolling stock, maybe your overhead. In that regard, you still may lose some money if you should choose not to charge for that visitation any longer, but you won't lose as much money. In fact, you'll retain some money, and you'll beef up your revenues to the amount that you budgeted for. Again, you won't see that. Well, you will. You'll see it at the end of the year, but you've already now let an entire year go by and loss on those revenues. So again, it's clearly important to look at those trends, watch them over a monthly basis, and make adjustments. Same exact things for expenses. I gave you the example of the water utilities, but other things, overtime for service delivery. If we have overtime that's rising at a percentage rate greater than what the call volume change is, we really have to ask ourselves, how are we staffing those services? If your call volume is going down and your overtime hours are going up, it does not necessarily mean that that you're doing anything wrong, but you certainly want to investigate that to determine whether or not you are spending more than you really should for your labor cost. Here, again, one to go back to the benchmarking that we have for industry standards. This, I believe you all will receive copies of this deck should you want to. If you would take a screenshot, I know this is something that people are often very interested in seeing. It gives you a way of comparing yourself to the rest of the funeral service world. These are based upon, as you mentioned before, the billions of dollars of sales that we've negotiated between funeral homes, that we analyze their enterprise value. And in doing that, we go through what their expenditures are so that both the seller and the purchaser understand if there's any value in running the funeral home differently. A person that's joining a funeral home with an existing funeral home may believe that there's some efficiency that is going to come out of their personnel costs. And if they see the funeral home that they're purchasing has unusually high personnel costs, they may say, well, that's a good deal for me. I'll be able to run that cheaper. In other respects, there might be facility costs that are over the amount that we would regularly expect. A purchaser may start to question, what is all that expense about? Is it a building that needs constant repair? Is it a building that recently had great repairs done, but now that's over with? So in the process of doing all those evaluations on these businesses when they exchange hands, we've come up with these industry standards. And there you see the range of those different expenses. You simply would take your total contract revenue for a year and multiply by those percentages, and you'll get a range for those different personnel costs. You then just compare that dollar amount against what you're spending, and you'll see how you compare with the rest of the funeral service world. So now we've been talking about revenues and we've been talking about expenses, and I want to give you a quick peek at the importance of focusing on both of them, but how looking at expenses can really make the biggest difference. For instance, if you had a business that was operating at a 30% profit margin, that would mean that in order to generate $30 more, that you would have to generate $100 more in revenue, because at 30% profit, only $30 of that 100 actually drops to the bottom line. However, because expenses are a dollar for dollar exchange, anytime you reduce that expense account, the profit goes directly to your bottom line. So if ever you're in a situation and you're looking to quickly change the outcome on your profits, obviously you do both, but if you can only choose one or the other, it's always going to be expenses. And that's why we look back at the chart that we gave you before. We don't necessarily want to have the first thing that somebody thinks about is cutting staff. If you can see that you're running high on fuel costs for vehicles, or there's another expense for something that you've taken on recently and you haven't seen a marketable difference in revenue growth or advertising costs, you can look through all your expenses and evaluate them one for one and see if there's expenses that you can eliminate or defer. I will caution anyone that's looking at deferred expenses for maintenance. Oftentimes that becomes a slippery slope and a dangerous proposition. if you push off deferred expenses for a long period of time, it far outweighs the long-term expense. You may have some simple roof repairs, but if ignored over several years, you may be now turned into a full roof repair tear-off and starting from scratch. So again, there may be times where you look at expenses and you have to make a good judgment over the long-term expense. Is it good to continue with something? If you're doing a major initiative to attract more business, do you want advertising to be the first thing that you cut off? Probably not, because you haven't had enough time for the expenses put into advertising to really impact that change in market share and increased call volume. Again, those are the difficult questions, but you can't answer them without the information. So going back to the value of your budget and the chart of accounts. So we talked about expense control and things that we can do. I'll show this to you. I won't go through line by line, but I'll give you some basic understanding. Cost of goods sold is always going to be related to your primary merchandise, the things that you purchase and then turn around and sell to a customer client family. Big piece there for caskets, vaults, or any major merchandise is to talk with your vendors. The vendors are in business too. They're looking for a profit margin just as we are, but they also understand that they're in a relationship, a partnership relationship with you, and they certainly want you to continue selling their products. There's nothing bad intended by just asking somebody if there's a better deal to be had. If they're willing to retain you as a client, they're probably willing to sit down and have a fruitful conversation about how they can help you spend less and make more. It's in everybody's best interest. For personnel, structured compensation plans where there's an understanding about where compensation starts and where it goes over the life of the individual. It's important to understand that in any personnel relationship that you're getting into, at least for my own benefit, I always think about that being a long-term relationship. I hire people or consult people to hire someone based on the belief that you're going to be working with them for the next 20 years. Do you have the ability to continue a developmental strategy that increases their pay over time so that they will be a long-time loyal employee? And you put into that bonuses and other compensation plans. And then finally, the review of the staffing and hiring practices. I was asked not long ago to comment on an article in another trade magazine, and they asked about the changing dynamics of staffing a funeral home. You really have to look at what changes are occurring in your funeral home, and if there's a changing trend towards cremation and you are providing embalming at 20% less than you used to, you may be looking to the future and trying to establish whether or not, if somebody on your staff was a primary embalmer, are we looking to replace somebody with only embalming skills, or do we want to start thinking as a more transferable skill set that, yes, they're very good at embalming, but they're also very good at making arrangements. You might be making decisions on whether or not to hire on specialty staff like a celebrant or something like that. Again, you're going to evaluate where those revenue sources are coming from, and are you providing the kind of services that are ultimately going to require a celebrant to be involved. Again, something that you want to develop. Facilities, it's going to change with every building that's out there, whether it's new or old, or it requires taking care of due to the community that you're in. It's just everything is going to be different on facilities. But again, the big thing is to talk with any third-party contracts that you're maintaining. In some parts of the world, they have snow removal, and that's going to be a major factor. In other parts of the world, it's going to be air conditioning to keep the building cooler for their clients. all the tracking of those utilities and understanding why you get charged what you get charged from the local utility is important to know. If there's benefits that they have, where there's areas or times where you can turn down or turn up the heat or the air conditioning to get a benefit and it won't impact your client families, it's something to consider. Automotive insurance and all the other expenses that go around, not unlike your own home vehicle. You're always going to evaluate and look at the expenses for your insurance, how much you're spending on the gas, how much everyone else is spending on the gas. Some funeral homes will have policies to assist staff members with driving long distances. As we struggle more and more to hire staffing for funeral homes, especially licensed, and the distance is greater and greater from where they live to where you operate, it may be that you provide a benefit like that, where there's some offset or some bonus that's created for covering gas expense. A key thing, though, is to monitor all those extra benefits so that you know what is actually being spent. You're going to want to maintain consistency and also be fair amongst your entire staff. Advertising, you always want to evaluate the effectiveness. Some of the big things that are coming out nowadays is with social media, and we've got assistance there that we can provide where you can have your area market evaluated for what your online resources are doing for you, whether or not you're getting the benefit of what you're spending. Again, anything with regards to spending is always a product of your return on investment. If you can't track what is being generated by what you're putting out there, you don't know whether or not the advertising that you're doing is worth the expense. So again, whenever you're doing something, make sure that you incorporate a tracking with regards to that. You can sometimes set up separate phone lines that if there's a billboard or something like that that's requiring you to make a call in, and you can set up a separate phone line to track the incoming calls for that particular piece of advertisement. It allows you to make better decisions on whether or not a billboard is in your best interest. Charitable expenses, another big piece. As funeral directors, funeral home owners, cemetery operators, we are generally very soft-hearted, very open to the community, and for most of us believe that it's a major part of our giving back to the community that generates loyalty for the business in the first place. However, it becomes a very slippery slope when everybody that knocks on the door is given $50, $100. It's important that you're picking and selecting charitable expenses that also are in line with what you do. So again, there's all kinds of charities that you might want to get involved with, all kinds of charities that may not be in your best interest other than simply giving them $50 or $100 to have them leave your vicinity. Again, that shouldn't be your choice on how you make your advertising. Other funeral expenses, again, comes down to monthly monitoring. Oftentimes people will buy large quantities of fluid for the prep room, and you'll see a spike in that, but you'll see that happen in a regular fashion, that every 3 months or 2.5 months, whatever that might be, you may see a spike in the fluid sales. But when you see that pattern, it makes sense. You understand that you're buying a quantity amount of fluid and then it's going off. On the other hand, if suddenly you see a spike in expenses that are not explainable, you're going to want to track that down. It may be that it was miscoded. It could have been the operating expenses for the funeral home itself. But again, it's important to separate out the funeral expenses so that we truly know what a service costs us. In the end, if you have services that are associated with a traditional funeral, it's going to be a more costly service because you probably are going to have more people on hand. you're going to be using more memorial paper products than potentially with a direct cremation. So again, as we mentioned before, if you saw a significant increase in the call volume, or a reduction in call volume, but your overtime went up, those are two different metrics going in the opposite direction. That doesn't make sense. The same thing here, if you saw a dramatic increase of direct cremation over time and you weren't functionally doing a service that included memorials, register books, and things like that, because it is a direct cremation, it may be the lead to several things. One, are you really providing a direct cremation, or is there possibly somebody on the staff that's selling a memorial service at a direct cremation charge? Or again, is there supplies and equipment and things like that that are not being properly registered, and you have an expense there that you really shouldn't have based on the change of your services? Finally, operating expenses overall for the whole company. Again, to go back to third-party contracts, very important. Evaluate them closely, look at them closely. We have multitude of third-party providers that are often on contracts to just automatically pick things up or deliver them, and that can get to be something that falls completely out of somebody's tracking and monitoring. Perfect example, for funeral homes that do catering, it's not unusual that they use the same linen service to provide the linen that goes on the catering tables for the public, as well as the sheets that are possibly used in the preparation room and for the transfer team. If that expense is just looped together because it's one vendor providing two different things, you really don't have an understanding of what your catering costs are going to be, and it may look as though your preparation room supplies expenses have gone way up. It has been my case many a time when taking a tour of the funeral home, and we do look over inventory and try to help to give ownership a perspective on that somebody will have an entire closet filled with tablecloths that are intended for someday when they're going to start their catering program and start it in earnest. But in the meantime, they have a third-party vendor providing the sheets for the preparation room, and because they've set up a standard supply for tablecloths, it's not in the vendor's best interest to warn you that you already have a closet full of tablecloths. It's in their best interest just to keep delivering every month. So if we don't monitor that, if we don't see where our inventory is going, many times we will continue to pay for things that we already have in stock. With that being said, we're going to have a question and answer period there. I would encourage everybody, if you have anything in,
Okay, Nelson, if anyone has a question, we have some here. And you still with us?
I am.
There you are. Okay, you're breaking up a little bit. Okay, we encourage people, if you have some questions, type them in. We have some already. And you were just touching on catering, Nelson. Here in New Jersey, there's a law on the governor's desk. We're one of the few states that still doesn't allow catering by funeral homes, but that may change soon. What advice would you give to funeral homes with their expenses to look out for if they're just starting catering for the first time?
Well, it's a very good and loaded question. The understanding, I think, that any funeral home has to come to grips with is you are not going to be in competition with the local restaurants. That's not the arena that we're operating in. I always give people the analogy of on your way home from work and you stop to get gas, but you realize you need a gallon of milk and you go into the Quick Trip or Speedy Mart or whatever that might be. You know that you're spending more money for that gallon of milk than if you went to a local store or a chain grocery store. But it's convenience. It's the availability to get a lot of things done in a short period of time. And that is the person that's looking for catering. It's somebody looking for convenience over cost. And so that is the first big advice I would say. Don't try to compare yourself with a local restaurant, other than the fact that what you can provide is generally far better than a cemetery. You can provide the appropriate setting, you can provide the appropriate staffing, and the opportunity to continue the services in a dignified and respectful manner. You won't be having a lunch in a restaurant that may also support a luncheon for the local Lions Club or Kiwanis Club, and you've got a lot of well-intended people having a pretty good time, and there you are in the next room trying to have a lunch that's just following a funeral service for a family member. We provide things that restaurants can't, and I think that's the first piece, is just that understanding. Based on that, it goes back to our original question. Ask yourself and fill in the blanks for how much will it take before you decide on how much you'll make. Once you know how much it takes to operate a catering service on the side or incorporate it into the funeral home, you'll begin to understand whether or not you've got the likelihood of families that are going to select it and select it enough in order to generate the offsetting revenues, and also whether or not your cost to provide, even though they're specialized, and we talked about the benefit of having catering in the funeral home, whether or not that may be a price tag that still is not something that most families are going to be able to afford. So that would be my key thing. Keep in your zone, realize what you're operating, and find out all the details of what it takes to operate a cremation catering service.
Okay, thank you on that one. And another question. You mentioned about negotiating with your vendors. How do you start that? Is it tough to do, and who would the best person be to speak to?
Call up your rep. You got the best reputation with them. They understand your business as well as you do. They understand the transition from burial to cremation. They probably, better than you, know what the mix is in terms of what you're selling for caskets. They'll be able to even, I think, provide you with some good advice. At least I would. If you said, you're really selling in this range of caskets, you maybe don't need to have the biggest, highest priced casket on the floor because you're keeping that and you're maintaining an inventory that's not realistic for you to be selling to the client families you're serving. But if you sit down and say, I'm really struggling and my revenues are down and I have to try to curb expenses, can you help me in some way do that? Any good representative from any company looking out for your best interest is going to sit down and say, let me help you out, Stan. We'll work out something. They want to do that. They want to keep your business. They want to make that a long-term relationship.
Okay. How about someone who's looking to expand? They have their first funeral home. They're comfortable with it, and all of a sudden they're thinking, maybe I should buy another one. What red flags, or what would you tell them to look out for before moving forward with that?
That's a good question. We do that quite often. We refer to it as doing a feasibility study. Funeral home owners will ask us a variation off of that, whether or not they want to enter into a market, whether they want to see if they can purchase a funeral home. So there's several different ways to go at that depending on the circumstances. If they were starting from scratch, we would do a feasibility study for them. We would look at the demographics, the changes that are happening over time. We have a connection with the CDC and the U.S. Census Bureau so that we can look at long-term tracking. We can evaluate deaths in the county and zip codes closest to where you're looking to build. And from that, then we also evaluate what's your competition. If there is no competition and you're simply entering an area that's underserved by any funeral home, that's great. But if you do have a client there, or not a client, a competitor that has a long-term standing, we have to put some numbers to the loyalty factor for that, and whether or not there's a possibility of you even pulling clients away from them. We look at our best estimates on what their pre-need program is, because people, once they've purchased a pre-need, that pretty well has locked them in with that funeral home. So you may go into a market that's growing, but if the market is growing because of a younger population coming in there, it may look good, but in the short term, you're still looking towards the older population who may have already made pre-arrangements, and you may come into an area that looks fertile on paper, but in reality, when you dive down into the numbers, you find out that you could be waiting decades for that to evolve. And if you don't have that amount of time to wait out and let a community develop for you, it may not be a good investment. With regards to purchasing someone else, that would be a part for the merger and acquisitions department, and they specialize in developing a relationship where they can contact someone, oftentimes without the need of involving the actual identity, but they can inquire as to whether somebody is interested in selling, and if they have any parameters on who or what they would sell it for. And it goes into an arrangement where funeral homes are evaluated by Johnson Consulting and come to a equitable agreement between both sides, and then it's all taken care of from that point.
Very good. And how much time should you give your budget before you make adjustments throughout the year if revenue is down in the first few months of that year?
So the key is there, never adjust your budget. What you make as your best guess, you should just live with that. The part in which you adjust it or change it again is the next year. If you have fluctuating metrics and you keep on making adjustments to those, it'll look good on paper, but you won't see the changes over time. So once that budget is done, we, in our area with Johnson Consulting, we talk about locking the budget down, and we don't change it from there. Even more importantly, if you see your numbers are not matching up with the budget, that tells you that you need to make corrective action. Now that you would do, again, monthly. I would suggest that if there's something happening and you can analyze it and identify what is causing that to happen, then you would make the changes immediately if it made sense. Otherwise, look at it for sure quarterly to see for those changes. But again, once a budget is done, it should be done and not toyed with until the following year when you do the budget all over again.
All right, we have a question from Kirk. How does one compete with a family of funeral homes that I am surrounded by when their set direct cremation is $700 less than ours?
Well, that could be the $1,000 question for practically everybody out there. Everybody is dealing with a competitor that is willing to undercut them or to go to some unreasonable level of what your cost is. I would say this for all, Kurt, is what we went back to from the very beginning. You have to look at what it takes you to run that business before you can calculate what you have to make out of it. And we go through this exercise a lot. This can be a little bit overwhelming when we're kind of doing theater of the mind here and you're just imagining this. So I'll make it very simple, but we adjust the expenses to what your revenue sources are. And when I say that, if you're looking at a 70% cremation rate versus a 30% burial rate, you then allocate expenses in that same way to those categories. And if your cremation revenue isn't supporting that percentage of cost, then you're spending or then you're charging not enough. And in the end, you can have a race to the bottom where both companies lose. They may, in fact, from a economy of scale, they may in fact be able to outperform you on what the cost is, and by doing so, they can charge a cheaper amount. But for sure, what won't happen is you won't go out of business because you've run yourself financially into the ground. You may have to develop different approaches to encouraging client families to come and see you. There's a series of things that you can do in terms of shopping strategies and things like that. But when you're talking simply the dollars versus my cremation charge is $2,100 and theirs is $895, you first have to establish what it is that's going to cost. Second of all, when you think about that, and you were saying, okay, I charge $2,000, my competition does it for $1,000, so I'm going to drop by $1,000 to meet that charge. If you're already doing 100 cremations a year, you have to understand that you just voluntarily cut your revenue stream by $100,000. Can you possibly do that many more cremations to offset that loss in revenue? I used to operate in an area where a discounter came in, and within 5 years, they had 20% of the marketplace, and that would seem like tragic results. But the truth of the matter is, our company was more profitable. They were low-level competitor, low price, and it ended up being oftentimes at the level of service that we were providing was costing us more when we tried to serve those families that had less to spend. And when they started going to an alternative provider, our long-term profits increased because we weren't caught up trying to provide something more than we could really afford to do.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. And what parts of the country have the higher operating expenses? And I guess it varies from different parts of the country, so if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you're right. I don't even know if you can equate it to parts of the country. You could, from the standpoint of there are parts of the country that have higher cremation costs and lower cremation costs. Obviously, cremation versus burial. All of those are going to be variations of what it takes you to operate within a particular community. It's just going to be a dynamic, not unlike what it cost of living is as you move around the country. But the cost of overall operation will certainly be affected by your level of service and then also your ability to manage your expenses again. It really just comes down to that equation: is what can you generate and what is it going to cost you to operate in that particular community. There's some communities that unless you maintain a certain level, you wouldn't be a welcome member of the community. And there's other communities that you can enter there with a storefront operation, and it's obviously much cheaper to operate a storefront operation or even an online presence versus a full brick and mortar traditional funeral home.
Okay, and our final question: is there a standard projection for revenue increases to aim for?
You broke up there on me a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Sure. Is there a standard projection for revenue increases that you should aim for?
Again, it really goes back to that. Our line here is going bad. It goes back to what we talked about before with regards to what it takes you to operate. If you are seeing a huge increase in what it takes you to maintain professional licensed staff, you may find out that you have to increase your expenses quite a bit in order to retain those people. In the volatile markets where funeral homes are actively pursuing their competition's hired licensed staff and non-licensed staff for that matter, you may find yourself in a situation where a standard 2.5–3% raise every year isn't enough to make it. And then you'll see that those expenses go up dramatically. So it's going to change on your market. It's going to change with where you are. It's going to change with the type of funeral provider you are, is going to affect those expenses. That being said, we typically look at a 2.5–3% revenue increase annually to cover, the majority of your increases with regards to cost of goods sold, overall cost of living, and salaries. So generally speaking, 2.5–3% will get you close to where you need to be if you do that annually.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nelson. We appreciate you doing this webinar for us today. And please visit AmericanFuneralDirector.com and click on the webinar tab to sign up for future webinars. While you are on our site, please also check out our Cremation Innovation Summit, which will be on September 13th in Columbus, Ohio. And we have other upcoming events too. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, and be sure to keep an eye out for our follow-up email, which will include today's webinar recording. Have a great day. Thank you. End webinar.